Welcome, students of Paul. Welcome, students of Paul. And today we're going to be talking about Paul and gender, but specifically about Paul and women today. And I hope that the sound is all right. It's quite windy today and sunny, and I hope that the sound is fine. So welcome to this session on Paul and specifically women. The reason that we're talking about this is that this is an issue that comes up fairly frequently in talking about the historical effects of Paul and the reception of Paul, how Paul's teachings have been so terrible for women over the millennia. So to begin, some comments. Paul was not a 21st century feminist, nor was he a 21st century chauvinist. And a passage that is often alluded to by people is Galatians 3:28. And especially by those who talk about how Paul was an egalitarian in terms of men and women. It's been a slogan for women's equality in Paul, but it may not actually be about that at all. And Galatians 3:28 is, "For now in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free." And the proper translation should be "nor male and female," because in the Greek that's what it says. The English translations have sometimes been wrong. Neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor male and female. And it's probably about marriage in the eschaton, because male and female is the biblical way of talking about marriage, about partnership. But in any case, Paul had and acknowledged apostolic forerunners and mentors who were women. So that's clear. We know from his undisputed letters, he had apostolic forerunners and he had mentors, people he looked up to as apostles who were women. Paul publicly gave thanks to women apostles in his letters. Paul gave instructions as to how women should speak in the Corinthian assembly. And this is one of those places where you go, is he speaking out of both sides of his mouth? Because on the one side, he's saying that women are apostles, and on the other, he's saying you must be silent. So we'll talk more about that. Paul's more feminist appraisal of women's roles almost certainly was linked to the soon-to-arrive day of the Lord. So I believe that Paul was actually remarkably egalitarian for his day. Again, not a 21st century feminist, but for his day, remarkably egalitarian. And the reason why was not necessarily because of some tendencies within him toward justice, but because of the soon-to-arrive day of the Lord, and to a community that had, since Jesus, incorporated women into leadership roles. I believe that Jesus also incorporated women in many ways, in ways that were not completely unknown in that day, but were still remarkable to us today. All right, let's keep going. Note that talking about Paul and gender means not just Paul and women, but also Paul and masculinity. We'll come back to that when we talk about masculinity. But when we say Paul and gender, we're not just talking about women, as if men are the default somehow and out of the picture. You must talk about both. We'll be talking about that in a different podcast. So let's get to some primary texts. What I'd like you to do is to stop the video now and just take a look at these two texts from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And we'll come back and talk about those in a second. All right, welcome back. Do take a look at the parts that I've highlighted here. In yellow, I've highlighted 1 Corinthians 7, 7-9. I wish that all were as I myself am. That could mean just about anything in a letter. But Paul comes out and explains what that means. What he's talking about is celibacy, in his case, as being alone, being an ascetic. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. That's where he explains it. And then 1 Corinthians 7, in view of the impending crisis, do not seek a wife. So clearly, is he talking to women here? No, he's talking to men, male believers. The appointed time has grown short. Let even those who have wives be as though they had none. Now that's interesting. What does that mean? That even those who have wives be as though they had none. Again, it's an appeal probably to an ascetic lifestyle on the part of both women and men, as we'll see. For the present form of this world is passing away. So is Paul a family man, in quotation marks, entre guillemets, or is he an ascetic? Well, exercise based on the previous slide. Take some time and then do this. Judging from what you've read, what was Paul's view of marriage? Number one. How did Paul rationalize this particular view of marriage? Number two. And in your opinion, is it coherent with what you know of his other thinking and theology? So take a second, jot down some notes that we can talk about when we come together. And let's and enjoy that statue if you want, which is a modern day. It's not a Rodin, but it's something like a Rodin, I think. Okay, Paul and family. and marriage. So again, two passages, again, 1 Corinthians 7. Notice this. Paul writes, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband." And then he puts in brackets, "But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband." And that's interesting, if she does separate. And then verse 12, "To the rest I say, I am not the Lord." So here he's saying this is not from him, from Jesus, but from him, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Now, isn't that interesting again? Who's got the say in that? And then 1 Corinthians, read the other two passages. And then let's take a look at the next slide. Exercise based on the previous slide. So again, take a moment, turn off the video, or stop the video so that you can take a look at these questions and then jot something down. In Roman society's conception of the paterfamilias, which is a term I hope that you'll learn, paterfamilias, the man had total control over every other person in his household, his wife, his slaves, and his children. It was absolute rule of the Roman male householder. Do Paul's thoughts in the previous slide agree with this? Why or why not? And number two, according to the later Gospels, Jesus seems to have forbidden divorce. Did Paul? Pretty easily answered questions, I think. But do take a moment to answer them so that we can come back and talk about them together. Women as Paul's co-workers and mentors. This is a picture of a woman I took in Pompeii on the fresco of a wall. So this was probably one of the people who lived in that particular villa or house in Pompeii when it was destroyed. Romans 16, 1-7. Paul writes, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Kenkre." Probably means Phoebe, who was the person who delivered and performed the letter, by the way. And then later on, greet Prisca and Aquila, who work with me. And then further down, greet Mary, greet Andronicus and Eunia, my relatives who are in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles and were in Christ before I was. And then 1 Corinthians 11, it has been reported to me by Chloe's people. Chloe is, that would mean Chloe's enslaved persons or messengers, and Chloe is a woman. So women as co-workers and mentors of Paul, there's lots of evidence in Paul's undisputed letters. But then see the pastoral letters. Again, remember the pastorals are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And take a look at this, 1 Timothy 2, 8-15, verse 11. "Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent." That's interesting. 1 Timothy 2, 8-15, which is supposedly by Paul. "Yet she will be saved through childbearing." And again, this is Paul who says you shouldn't even get married. She will be saved through childbearing. So quite a difference. And also, just as a note, some people will say, well, don't forget, in Paul, even in the undisputed letters, Paul says some rough things. And so this is here, 1 Corinthians 14. "Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church." Now, how does that go along with what we just read in 1 Corinthians, where Paul talks about all of these women who were apostles before him and who were his mentors, and one of whom is carrying his letter and clearly going to speak in church, Phoebe, because she's going to be reading his letter in the assembly in Corinth. So how does that work? Well, other ancient authorities put verses 34-35 after verse 40. In other words, this piece of text did not have a particular position in the early manuscripts. Was it a marginal note that was later included? Some people say that. Some people also just say that Paul may have been dealing with a very specific issue in terms of, when you read 1 Corinthians, there were problems in the assemblies, people speaking in tongues out of order, people doing other things out of order, and Paul is trying to bring a kind of order to their worship. And it could be that Paul is doing something very specific about a group of women prophets here. We don't know for sure, but it certainly is jarring that this is in his undisputed letters. And I think it has to do with the context of the church in Corinth specifically. Again, the pastorals, which I think are at least a half a century later, but in Paul's name, are pro-family, pro-marriage, and pro-procreation. And just a note, the subordination of women tends to grow with an emphasis on family and social structure, a certain view of family and social structure. And an emphasis on family and social structure shows a movement that plans to be around for a while. In other words, that's not eschatological. So if you say a woman will be saved through childbearing or raise up your children well or things, you're talking about the future. You're thinking about the future, which we know Paul didn't, because he didn't, he did. He believed that there would be a future for the God of Israel and an inbreaking, but he didn't even believe that people should get married in his earlier letters. And that's it. So Paul and women, we've got some contradictory evidence, but almost always, not entirely, but almost always, the passages which to us seem very anti-women are in the pastoral letters, very much about keeping their place. And the passages which are much more, seem to show that Paul was indebted to women, that women were mentors to him, and that he worked together with women are in the undisputed letters. All right, thanks for this, and I'll talk to you next time. See you soon.